At our father's funeral, the air thick with the scent of lilies and soft piano notes, Vanessa leaned in close, her diamond earrings glinting under the dim chandelier light, her voice a venomous whisper. Poor you, still single at 38. I got the man, the money, the mansion. I'm Laura, the elder daughter who stood by Dad's casket, feeling the weight of mourners' eyes and the sting of her words. 4 years ago, Vanessa stole my fiancé Darren, dismantling my life like a house of cards. Now at 38, I stood alone, or so she thought, her cruelty timed perfectly to pierce my grief. But the tension in my chest wasn't just pain, it was anticipation, a spark of something stronger. The funeral home's velvet curtains swayed as a breeze slipped through, carrying the faint hum of whispered condolences. I smiled, calm as a still lake, and said, "Have you met my husband?" Calling Marcus over, I watched Vanessa's smirk vanish, her hands tremble, her confidence unravel as she recognized him instantly. This wasn't just my husband. This was Marcus Hamilton, the man who'd outmaneuvered Darren in business, a name that carried weight she couldn't ignore. The soft clink of coffee cups and murmured sympathies filled the room, but all I could hear was the thud of my own heartbeat, steady now, not frantic like it used to be. Vanessa's black Chanel dress hugged her curves, her platinum blonde hair cascading in waves that screamed hours at the salon. She'd always known how to weaponize perfection, her grief as curated as her makeup. "Look at you," she'd hissed, her voice low but sharp, "standing here all alone while everyone else has moved on." The words burned, rekindling the shame I'd felt since childhood, whenever she'd remind me I was less glamorous, less wanted. I felt the heat creep up my neck, the familiar flush of embarrassment, but I held my ground. If you're reading this, thank you for joining me in stories of resilience and triumph. Hit that subscribe button if you believe betrayal can forge something beautiful. It's free, and it helps share hope with others. Now let's see how this unfolds. Vanessa adjusted her diamond bracelet with deliberate slowness, each gesture a calculated jab. "When was the last time you even went on a date? When was a man interested in you?" The questions landed like punches, and I couldn't recall the last time. I'd been so focused on rebuilding after her betrayal. The years had blurred into work, therapy, and quiet nights piecing myself back together. "Darren and I were just talking," she continued, glancing at my former fiancé by the guest book, his salt and pepper hair pristine in his tailored suit. "How sad that you never recovered from losing him. Never recovered. As if I were some broken thing, pining for a man who'd chosen my sister." Her voice dripped with mock pity, a tone she'd perfected. "He feels terrible, you know, but the heart wants what it wants." Her delicate shrug dismissed the wreckage she'd caused, stealing not just my fiancé but my trust and family. The mourners' whispers grew louder, sensing the tension. Aunt Margaret glanced over, her brow furrowed, while Dad's old friends shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just worried about you," Vanessa said, her tone syrupy now. "Standing here, no husband, no children, no real life. Dad worried too, you know. He'd ask if you'd ever find someone." The mention of Dad stung, as if he'd seen me as a failure too. She gestured toward Darren, signing the guest book with his Mont Blanc pen, the same one he'd used for our apartment lease, probably their wedding certificate too. "I have everything," she said. "A husband who adores me, a beautiful home, financial security." Each word was a blade, slicing at my modest Seattle life. A one-bedroom apartment with a view of the Sound, a marketing job I loved, but she'd call honest work. My cheeks burned hotter, but I refused to let her see me crack. Then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the therapy I'd fought through, the 2 years with Marcus showing me real love, not the desperate need I'd mistaken for it with Darren. "Actually, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady, surprising even me, "there's something you should know." She turned, eyebrows raised, expecting weakness. "I'm not alone. I haven't been for a long time." I smiled, genuinely, as Marcus approached through the crowd, his navy sweater catching the light. The color drained from Vanessa's face, her foundation failing to hide her shock. She recognized him, Marcus Hamilton, not just my husband but Darren's professional nemesis. Darren froze too, his pen pausing mid-signature. The room seemed to hold its breath, the piano's notes fading as all eyes turned to us. Marcus extended his hand, his voice calm but firm. "Marcus Hamilton, I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I know who you are." Vanessa's hand shook as she took his. Her confidence shattered in seconds. The tables had turned, and for the first time, I felt the scales tip in my favor. The memory crashed over me like a rogue wave, pulling me back 4 years as I watched the recognition dawn in Vanessa's eyes. 4 years melted away in an instant, and I was 34 again, standing in the ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel at the annual Children's Cancer Research Gala. The chandeliers cast golden light across designer gowns and tuxedos. Champagne flutes clinked in celebration of the evening's fundraising success, and I had just met the man I thought would change my life forever. Darren Mitchell stood near the silent auction display, studying a weekend getaway package to Napa Valley, with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making important decisions. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his confidence evident in the way he carried himself, not arrogant, just assured. When our mutual friend Sarah introduced us, his handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his eyes held mine just long enough to make my pulse quicken. "Laura works at Precision Marketing," Sarah had explained. "She's the creative genius behind that viral campaign for the eco-friendly startup everyone's talking about." "Impressive," Darren had said, and something in his tone made me believe he actually meant it. "I've been following that company's growth. Brilliant positioning strategy." We talked for 20 minutes about sustainable business practices, the challenges of startup marketing, and the delicate balance between profit and purpose. He listened, really listened, asking thoughtful questions that showed he valued my opinions. When he asked for my business card, I felt like I was floating, a lightness in my chest that hinted at possibilities I hadn't considered in years of focusing on my career. Our first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Pioneer Square. He arrived with a single white tulip, my favorite flower, which he'd somehow remembered from our brief conversation about spring gardens. The gesture felt both thoughtful and perfectly understated, not flashy but sincere. We talked until the restaurant staff began stacking chairs around us, lost in discussions about travel dreams, family traditions, and the books that had shaped our worldviews. By our third date, I was already imagining introducing him to my family. He had this way of making me feel heard, valued, like my thoughts and dreams mattered to someone who understood ambition and success. When he kissed me goodnight outside my apartment building, his lips soft and tentative, I felt like the heroine of every romance novel I'd secretly devoured. Dad loved him immediately. They bonded over golf, business strategy, and their shared appreciation for single malt whiskey. I'd find them on the back porch during family dinners, deep in conversation about market trends and investment opportunities. Dad would light up whenever Darren's name came up, constantly praising his intelligence, his work ethic, his obvious devotion to me. "That boy's going places," Dad would say, beaming with pride as if Darren were already his son-in-law. "And he clearly adores you, sweetheart. The way he looks at you, like you hung the moon." Even Mom, who'd passed away 2 years earlier, would have approved. I could feel her presence sometimes during those early months with Darren, could almost hear her whispering that I'd finally found someone worthy of her oldest daughter. Vanessa's initial reaction had been carefully calibrated enthusiasm. She gushed about how perfect we looked together, how lucky I was to have found such a catch, how excited she was to potentially have Darren as a brother-in-law. But even then, something felt slightly off about her effusiveness. Her compliments came too quickly, her smile seemed practiced, and her hugs lasted just a beat too long, as if she were studying him rather than simply welcoming him to the family. "He's absolutely gorgeous," she'd whispered to me after our first family barbecue, her fingers lingering on my arm. "Those eyes, that smile, you better hold on to him tight, sis. Men like that don't stay single long." The comment had made me laugh at the time, but looking back, it felt more like a warning than encouragement, a subtle seed of doubt planted with sisterly affection. The engagement came 8 months later, during a weekend trip to Vancouver. Darren had planned everything perfectly. A sunset dinner at a waterfront restaurant, a private table overlooking the harbor, the ring hidden in a dessert that arrived with, "Will you marry me?" written in chocolate script across the plate. I said yes before he'd even finished his nervous speech about wanting to spend forever making me happy. The ring was beautiful, A classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught light like captured starfire. Not the biggest stone I'd ever seen, but elegant and timeless. I wanted something that would suit you, Darren had explained. Classic, sophisticated, enduring. Wedding planning consumed the next 6 months of my life. I threw myself into every detail with the same intensity I brought to my marketing campaigns. Venue scouting, dress fittings, menu tastings, flower arrangements. Vanessa offered to help, and I gratefully accepted. She had an eye for style and unlimited time since she'd recently left her job at the art gallery. "Let me handle the vendor meetings," she'd insisted. "You're so busy with work, and I love this stuff. We want everything to be perfect for your special day." Her dedication seemed touching at first. She attended cake tastings when I couldn't leave the office, met with photographers to review portfolios, even helped coordinate with Darren's groomsmen about tuxedo fittings. I felt lucky to have such a supportive sister, someone who cared enough about my happiness to invest so much time and energy in making my wedding dreams come true. But gradually, small cracks began to appear in my perfect life. Darren started working later, missing dinners we'd planned, arriving at my apartment with apologies and explanations about difficult clients and project deadlines. His phone buzzed constantly during our time together, texts and calls that he'd answer with quick, whispered conversations in the hallway or bathroom. "Sorry, babe," he'd say, returning with a distracted kiss on my forehead. "Crisis at the office. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I worked in a demanding field too, but something about his explanations felt rehearsed, like lines he'd practiced in advance. Then there was the perfume, subtle at first, just a hint of something floral and expensive clinging to his shirts when I picked up his dry cleaning. Not my scent. I'd always preferred clean, simple fragrances like vanilla or lavender. This was more sophisticated, more complex, gardenias and jasmine with undertones of something darker, more sensual. "Must be from a client meeting," he'd explained when I mentioned it. "You know how some women go overboard with perfume in professional settings." The explanation made sense, but the scent appeared more frequently. On his jacket after late meetings, on his car seats, even once on his pillow when I stayed over at his apartment. Each time, he had a reasonable explanation. A female colleague who rode in his car, a client dinner at a restaurant where the hostess had been over-perfumed, a hotel room that hadn't been properly aired out between guests. Meanwhile, Vanessa was becoming increasingly involved in our relationship. She dropped by Darren's office with coffee and pastries, claiming she was in the neighborhood after meeting with wedding vendors. She'd text him directly about ceremony details instead of going through me, explaining that she didn't want to bother me during busy workdays. "Your sister is amazing," Darren would say after these encounters. "So thoughtful, so organized. You're lucky to have someone who cares so much about making your day perfect." I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt oddly displaced, like I was watching my own wedding being planned from the outside. Vanessa knew details about our flowers that I hadn't approved, had opinions about our menu choices that somehow carried more weight than mine, and spoke about our vision as if she were the bride instead of the helpful sister. The air in the ballroom that night had been electric with promise. But now, standing at the funeral, I saw how those early sparks had been illusions, carefully crafted to hide the storm brewing. Vanessa's involvement hadn't been sisterly help. It was the beginning of her calculated encroachment, testing boundaries I hadn't even known existed. As Marcus stood beside me, his hand warm in mine, I felt the contrast sharply. Real support versus the facade Darren and Vanessa had built. The breaking came on a Thursday evening in March, my head pounding with a splitting headache as I decided to surprise Darren with dinner from his favorite Thai restaurant. His assistant had mentioned he was working late on a proposal, so I figured he'd appreciate the food and company. The building directory in his office lobby listed his company on the 14th floor. I took the elevator up, balancing takeout containers in my purse, mentally rehearsing the smile I'd flash when he looked up from his computer. The hallway was dimly lit, most offices empty, but his door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor. Voices drifted out, his familiar baritone and another that made my blood run cold. "We can't keep doing this," Darren was saying, his voice heavy with an emotion I'd never heard before. "She's gonna find out." "Not if we're careful," came Vanessa's unmistakable whisper. "The wedding's only 2 months away. After that, we can figure out how to." I pushed the door open without thinking, my hands moving on instinct. The takeout containers hit the floor, curry and styrofoam crashing across the carpet, but I barely noticed. They were tangled on his leather couch, her dress half unbuttoned, his shirt gone. 4 months of wedding planning, 8 months of love, 2 years of believing in forever, all crumbled in one heartbeat. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Vanessa's face flushed with shame, maybe triumph, as if being caught was part of the thrill. "Laura," Darren stammered, reaching for his shirt with shaking hands, we didn't mean for." But I was already backing away, my engagement ring sliding off my finger before I could stop myself. It hit his desk with a tiny crystalline sound, louder than my breaking heart. I ran, the sound of my car door slamming echoing through the empty parking garage beneath my apartment building. I'd driven straight through from home, stopping only for gas and bitter coffee, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. By Spokane, the GPS guided me to a Craigslist-found address in Seattle's Capitol Hill. A studio apartment rented sight unseen because the landlord waived the credit check for an extra month's deposit. The building smelled of old carpet and disinfectant, the narrow staircase groaning under my suitcases, a box of books, my laptop, and a pitiful collection of kitchen essentials grabbed in a frantic 15-minute escape. Apartment 4C was smaller than I'd imagined, 400 square feet if I was generous. A Murphy bed dominated one wall, a kitchenette barely fit one person, and 2 windows overlooked a brick wall and an alley where cats fought over garbage. The hardwood floors bore scars of past tenants, the bathroom a cramped afterthought. It was perfect, anonymous, affordable, and far from anything that reminded me of Darren or Vanessa. That first week, I ate cereal for every meal, crying at random, in the grocery store checkout line, folding clothes during TV commercial breaks, making coffee for 1 instead of 2. My bank account dwindled terrifyingly fast. I'd quit my job in a fit of rage, sending a brutally honest resignation email that burned every bridge. Savings that once seemed solid now looked pathetic, stretched over rent, utilities, and groceries in a new city. The job search was torture. Every interview demanded explanations for my employment gap, forcing me to craft lies about seeking new challenges instead of admitting I'd fled after finding my fiancé and sister together. Rejection emails arrived like clockwork, each one whispering I was as broken as I felt. After 3 desperate weeks, a call came from Bloom Creative, a small digital marketing agency needing an administrative assistant to answer phones, schedule meetings, and organize chaotic files. The pay was barely above minimum wage, benefits non-existent, the office a converted warehouse smelling of coffee and printer ink. I accepted instantly. My first day, I arrived 20 minutes early, sitting in my car, pep-talking myself. You can answer phones, file papers, act normal for 8 hours. The office buzzed with creative chaos. Designers hunched over monitors, account managers juggling client calls with charm and panic. My desk, tucked near reception, held an ancient computer, a ringing phone, and a filing system organized by someone mid-breakdown. My supervisor, Janet, a harried woman in her 50s, spoke in rapid-fire sentences, surviving on coffee. Answer politely, schedule without conflicts. Don't lose papers, she'd said, adding, and don't take the creative team's sarcasm personally. They're artists. They thrive on existential crises. The work was mind-numbing, but a mercy, distracting me from my grief. I answered calls from clients obsessed with purple logos, scheduled meetings between people who loathed each other, and filed invoices with precision, grateful for tasks that couldn't break me. Lunch breaks found me at Pike Place Market, on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay, watching ferries glide across water that shifted from gray to blue to near black. I'd eat deli sandwiches, imagining who I might become in this strange city. The waves lapped steadily, a rhythm that promised I could start over, even if I didn't yet believe it. Back at the funeral, Vanessa's pale face reminded me how far I'd come from that shattered moment. Her smugness, no match for the life I'd rebuilt from nothing. After 2 months of barely surviving at Bloom Creative, Janet pulled me aside one Friday after work, her coffee mug steaming in her hand like always. "You seem competent," she said, which I'd learned was her version of high praise. And you're the first admin we've had who doesn't cry when the designers get cranky. How would you feel about taking on some client coordination responsibilities? It comes with a raise. The additional duties involved managing project timelines, serving as a buffer between creative teams and demanding clients, and occasionally writing emails that required actual thinking rather than just scheduling. For the first time since fleeing home, I felt like my brain was being used for something more complex than basic survival. A small victory in the midst of my ongoing isolation. One particularly stressful Thursday, after a client screamed at me over the phone about font choices for 20 minutes, I found myself crying in the bathroom stall during lunch. Not the gentle tears of grief I'd grown accustomed to, but ugly, frustrated sobs from feeling overwhelmed by the simplest adult tasks. "Rough day?" asked a voice from the neighboring stall. I looked down to see sensible black flats and gray slacks. Ruth from accounting, a woman in her early 40s with prematurely silver hair and an endless supply of cardigans who'd been unfailingly kind since my first day. "Just client stuff," I managed, trying to steady my voice. "Want to grab a drink after work? I know a place with terrible wine and excellent therapy potential." Something about her matter-of-fact offer broke through my carefully maintained walls. "I don't really drink much anymore," I admitted. "Neither do I, but sometimes sitting in a bar and pretending you might order alcohol is exactly the kind of normal you need." We ended up at a dive bar called the Comet, nursing ginger ales and sharing a basket of greasy fries while Ruth told me about her divorce 3 years earlier and her ongoing battles with her teenage daughter's rebellion phase. "You know what saved my sanity?" she asked, stealing a fry from my side. "Therapy. Good therapy, not the kind where someone just nods and asks how that makes you feel." She slid a business card across the sticky table. "I found this woman, Dr. Patricia Chen, who basically rebuilt my brain from the ground up. She's expensive, but worth every penny, and she has a sliding scale for people rebuilding their lives." Dr. Chen's office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of sterile and clinical, it felt warm and lived in. Bookshelves lined with psychology texts mixed with novels and poetry, her desk covered in succulents in mismatched pots, a large window overlooking a small garden where wind chimes created a gentle soundtrack. "Tell me about the person you were before," she said during our first meeting, her voice carrying a slight accent that made every word sound carefully considered. I'd expected to dive into Darren, the betrayal, the canceled wedding. But instead we spent weeks exploring who I'd been pre-trauma. The ambitious marketing pro who'd landed her dream job out of college. The daughter who'd organized surprise anniversary parties for her parents. The friend who drives 6 hours to help someone move. "Trauma has a way of making us forget our own strength," Dr. Chen explained during one tough session, her eyes kind but unflinching. "You survived something that would break many. That's not weakness. That's remarkable resilience." Slowly, painfully, I began remembering I was more than betrayed. I was capable. With a career built from scratch, friendships sustained through years, confidence enough to present to executive rooms without faltering. Healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong, ready to rebuild with purpose. Others I'd cry over a romantic comedy trailer or avoid the grocery store to dodge happy couples. But gradually, good days outnumbered bad. Ruth's friendship became my anchor. She invited me to her book club, a group of women meeting monthly in living rooms to discuss novels over wine. At first, I sat quietly in corners, contributing little to talks about complex characters and twists. But as months passed, I engaged more, offering opinions, laughing at jokes. "You're different," Ruth observed one evening as we walked to our cars after a lively discussion on a post-war London mystery. "When you first joined, you looked ready to bolt. Now you seem like you wanted to be here." She was right. For the first time in months, I'd spent an evening without thinking of Darren or Vanessa, fully present in others' stories. That night, I called Dr. Chen, leaving a voicemail. "I think I'm ready to start dating again, not because I'm lonely, but because I might have something to offer." Her return call came morning. "That," she said, "is exactly the right reason." Dating post-betrayal felt like relearning to walk after an accident. Every step tentative, braced for pain. My first try was disastrous. Ruth set me up with her neighbor's brother, Kevin, an accountant who spent our coffee date explaining his coin collection and vintage baseball cards' investment potential. I excused myself after 45 minutes, claiming a work emergency, driving home wondering if I was doomed to cheaters or bores. The second was worse. A software engineer from an app who arrived late, ordered extravagantly, then mansplained my marketing career. When he suggested splitting the bill after his feast while I'd had a salad and one wine, I saw the universe's message. Maybe I'm meant to be single, I told Dr. Chen next session. Maybe some are designed for solitude. Or maybe, she replied with her knowing smile, you're not meeting the right people in the right way. Sometimes connections happen when we're not searching. She was right, though I wouldn't know for 3 more months. In those early Seattle days, isolation wrapped around me like fog off the sound, thick and disorienting, making every small step, grocery shopping alone, folding laundry for one, feel like a mountain. But therapy and Ruth chipped away at it, revealing glimpses of light, hints that solitude could evolve into self-sufficiency. Back at the funeral, as Vanessa stammered, I silently thanked those lonely nights. They'd forged the woman who could stand here unbroken. Marcus walked into my life on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a box of promotional materials for a client presentation and wearing a navy blue sweater that brought out the gray in his eyes. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5'10", but he moved with a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and when he smiled at Janet while introducing himself, the expression seemed genuine rather than practiced. "This is Laura," Janet said, gesturing toward my desk. "She'll be your point person for the Morrison Hotels project." He turned to me with that same smile, extending his hand in a firm handshake that lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time, long enough to be warm, short enough to remain professional. "Marcus Hamilton," he said, "I'm looking forward to working with you." His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested either a long-time smoking habit or naturally low vocal cords. When our eyes met, I felt a small flutter of something that might have been attraction. But I pushed it down immediately. Work was work, and I'd learned to keep those boundaries crystal clear. Marcus owned a boutique consulting firm that specialized in hospitality industry marketing, restaurants, hotels, tourism boards. His approach was methodical and thorough, unlike many clients who changed their minds every few days and expected us to read their thoughts about color schemes and font preferences. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours. While most clients spent project kickoffs talking about themselves and their revolutionary vision for disrupting their industry, Marcus asked questions about our process, our timeline, our previous experience with similar brands. He took notes in a leather-bound notebook, writing with an expensive pen that he handled like a precision instrument. "What do you think makes a hospitality brand memorable?" he asked me directly while Janet was distracted by a phone call. The question caught me off guard. Most clients treated me like a glorified secretary whose opinion on strategy was neither wanted nor valued. "Consistency," I said after a moment's thought, "not just in visual identity but in experience. The best hotel brands make you feel the same way whether you're in New York or Nashville. They understand that luxury isn't about thread count, it's about feeling understood." He nodded slowly, making another note. "That's exactly right. Most people think hospitality marketing is about amenities and location, but it's really about emotional connection." Over the following weeks, Marcus became my favorite client to work with. He responded to emails promptly, provided feedback that was specific and actionable, and never once raised his voice or questioned my competence when project details needed adjustment. When our designer quit unexpectedly in the middle of his campaign, leaving us scrambling to meet deadlines, Marcus simply asked what he could do to help, rather than threatening to take his business elsewhere. "I could reach out to some freelancers I've worked with before," he offered during an emergency meeting. "No obligation to use them, but it might give you some options while you're interviewing replacements." The freelancer he recommended ended up being exactly what we needed: talented, reliable, and available immediately. When I thanked him for the referral, He shrugged, as if helping solve our staffing crisis was the most natural thing in the world. Good people should support each other, he said simply. Our professional relationship began shifting into something more personal during the final weeks of his project. He started arriving a few minutes early for meetings, lingering afterward to chat about everything except work. I learned he'd grown up in Portland, studied business at Northwestern, and moved to Seattle 5 years earlier to be closer to his aging mother. He asked about my background with genuine curiosity, listening to my carefully edited stories about leaving my hometown for new opportunities without pressing for details I wasn't ready to share. "You seem like someone who's lived through interesting times," he said one afternoon as we walked to his car after a particularly productive strategy session. "Interesting is one way to put it," I replied, surprised by how much I wanted to tell him the whole truth. "The best people usually have complicated stories," he said, unlocking his car, a practical Honda that was impeccably clean inside and out. Simple backgrounds tend to produce boring personalities. When his project officially concluded, I felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Our meetings had become the highlight of my work week, small islands of intelligent conversation and genuine respect in an ocean of difficult clients and impossible deadlines. "I hope we'll work together again soon," I said as we shook hands in the lobby after our final presentation. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I'd never heard from him before, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner sometime. Not work-related, just dinner." The invitation hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he quickly added, "No pressure. I just thought it might be nice to continue our conversations without project deadlines hanging over us." "I'd like that," I heard myself saying before my anxious brain could construct a list of reasons to decline. Our first non-work dinner was at a small French bistro in Fremont. Marcus had chosen the restaurant carefully, intimate enough for real conversation, but public enough to feel safe. He arrived with a single white tulip, just like Darren had on our first date, but somehow the gesture felt completely different. Where Darren's flower had felt calculated, designed to impress, Marcus's tulip seemed thoughtful and understated. "I remembered you mentioned these were your favorites," he said, looking almost embarrassed by his own romanticism. We talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing naturally from travel dreams to family memories to books we'd loved and movies that had disappointed us. Marcus was funny in an unexpected way, his humor dry and observational rather than attention-seeking. He made me laugh until my cheeks hurt, something I hadn't done in longer than I cared to remember. When he walked me to my car, I found myself hoping he'd ask me out again before I'd even driven away. He did. 3 days later, with a text that was perfectly Marcus. Direct but warm. "Would you like to try that new Thai place downtown Saturday? I promise not to order anything too spicy if you promise to tell me more about your book club's latest dramatic selection." Our second date led to a third, then a fourth. Slowly, carefully, we began building something that felt both exciting and safe. Marcus never pushed for information about my past, never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, never made assumptions about what I wanted or needed. He simply showed up, consistently, reliably, offering companionship without conditions. 3 months into dating, during a quiet dinner at his apartment, Marcus poured himself a second glass of wine and said, "There's something I should probably tell you about my work history." My stomach clenched automatically. Experience had taught me that sentences beginning with, "There's something I should tell you," rarely ended well. "I used to compete directly with someone you might know," he continued, his eyes meeting mine across the candlelit table. "Darren Mitchell. Small world, right?" The wine glass slipped from my fingers, hitting the table with a sharp clink that echoed in the sudden silence. Marcus reached across immediately, steadying both the glass and my trembling hand. "I figured you might have a reaction," he said gently. "Want to talk about it?" The revelation hung there, connecting my past and present in ways I hadn't anticipated, but Marcus's calm presence made it feel like something we could navigate together. Not a barrier, but a shared truth. The silence that followed my introduction stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, the funeral home's air heavy with unspoken questions. As Marcus stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside me. Vanessa's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions I'd never seen from her before. Shock, recognition, confusion, and finally something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Marcus Hamilton," he said, extending his hand to Vanessa with the same professional courtesy he'd shown countless clients. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I certainly know who you are." Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she accepted his handshake, her usual predatory confidence nowhere to be found. The woman who'd built a career out of manipulating social situations suddenly looked like she'd forgotten how to speak. Darren had gone completely rigid beside her. His face pale beneath his expensive tan, he looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand with no rope in sight. "Hamilton," Darren said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Family connections," Marcus replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Laura's father was a remarkable man, though I suppose you knew that, having been engaged to his daughter once upon a time." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread outward to the other mourners within earshot. I could see heads turning, whispered conversations pausing, as people tried to piece together the sudden tension crackling between the four of us. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been standing near the flower arrangements, took a small step closer, her hearing aid probably picking up more than she pretended. Behind her, Dad's business partner Robert Chin watched our little group with the sharp attention of someone recognizing the early stages of significant drama. "Engaged?" Vanessa's voice cracked slightly on the word, as if she were just now processing the full implications of Marcus's presence. "Laura, you never mentioned." "There's a lot I never mentioned," I said quietly, surprised by how calm I felt. The anxiety that had clawed at my chest since entering the funeral home had transformed into something else, not quite satisfaction, but a deep sense of rightness, as if the universe had finally decided to balance the scales. Marcus's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The simple touch communicated volumes: solidarity, support, and an unshakable certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. "You two are married?" Darren asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that bordered on insulting, as if the idea that I could have found someone successful and accomplished, was beyond his comprehension. 2 years this October," Marcus replied, his thumb tracing a gentle circle across my wedding ring. "Laura's brought more joy to my life than I thought possible." The declaration was simple but devastating in its sincerity, where Darren had always spoken about our relationship in terms of what I could do for him: boost his social standing, support his ambitions, provide companionship when convenient. Marcus spoke about what I'd given him simply by existing. I watched Vanessa's face as the full scope of the situation began to dawn on her. This wasn't just any random man I'd married to spite her. This was Marcus Hamilton, someone whose name clearly meant something to both her and Darren, whose presence here represented far more than a simple romantic rebound. "But how did you?" she started, then stopped, apparently realizing that any question she asked would only dig her deeper into whatever hole she was discovering beneath her feet. "How did we meet?" I supplied helpfully. "Marcus was a client at my marketing firm in Seattle. We worked together on a campaign for Morrison Hotels. Such a successful project. It really established his company as a major player in hospitality consulting." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to highlight not just Marcus's professional success, but also my own confidence and independence. The woman standing here wasn't the broken, abandoned creature Vanessa had expected to find. I'd built a career, a life, a marriage, all without her permission or oversight. Robert Chin had moved closer now, no longer pretending not to eavesdrop, his eyes holding a glimmer of recognition that made Darren shift uncomfortably. "Hamilton," Robert said, stepping into our circle with the confidence of someone who'd just connected important dots. "Weren't you the one who landed the Pacific Northwest Tourism Board contract? Quite the coup from what I heard, especially considering the competition." Marcus nodded modestly. "We were fortunate to present the strongest proposal." Strongest proposal, Darren repeated, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Is that what you're calling it? I'm calling it good business, Marcus corrected gently. Though I understand your perspective might be different. The exchange was subtle enough that casual observers might miss its significance, but I could see understanding dawning on several faces around us. Whatever had happened between Marcus and Darren in their professional lives, it hadn't ended well for Darren. You underbid us by 30%, Darren said, abandoning any pretense of funeral propriety. That's not strategy, that's desperation. I provided better value, Marcus replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. There's a difference. The clients certainly seem to think so, considering they've retained our services for 3 additional projects since then. Vanessa's eyes darted between the two men like she was watching a tennis match, her usual social sophistication completely abandoned. She looked lost, confused, like someone who'd walked into a movie halfway through and couldn't follow the plot. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. How long have you two known each other professionally? About 6 years, Marcus said. Though we've only worked in direct competition twice, both times were illuminating. Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of not listening and was now openly staring at our group. Behind her, other mourners began to cluster closer, drawn by the unmistakable energy of family drama unfolding in real time. Laura never mentioned any of this, Vanessa said, her voice gaining a slight edge as she tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Laura and I don't discuss my business rivalries at home, Marcus replied smoothly. We prefer to focus on more pleasant topics, though I suspect she might have found this particular connection amusing, given the circumstances. The understatement hung in the air like incense. Amusing barely began to cover how I felt about discovering that my new husband had not only known my ex-fiancé, but had apparently bested him in business on multiple occasions. Darren's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The composure he'd maintained throughout the funeral was cracking, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath his polished exterior. You planned this, he said suddenly, his voice loud enough to carry to the growing circle of observers. This whole thing, meeting Laura, marrying her, it's all some elaborate revenge scheme. The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that I actually laughed. The sound emerged before I could stop it, bright and genuine in the heavy atmosphere of grief and tension. Revenge? I repeated, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over our corner of the funeral home. You think I married Marcus to get back at you? The idea was so ridiculous that even some of the eavesdropping mourners looked skeptical. Darren's paranoia showing his inflated sense of importance on full display for everyone to see. That would require me to still care about you enough to plan revenge, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. It would require me to think about you at all. The truth of that statement hit me as I spoke it. For the first time in 4 years, I realized Darren had become irrelevant to my life. Not someone I hated, but simply someone who no longer mattered. Marcus squeezed my hand gently, a small gesture of approval that grounded me in the present moment. Around us, the whispered conversations had resumed with new intensity. I could see the story spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. The sister who'd stolen the fiancé, the abandoned bride who'd found something better, the business rivals meeting at a family funeral. By tomorrow, half the town would know that Laura had married the man who'd outmaneuvered Darren in business, and the other half would be calling their friends to catch up on the gossip. Vanessa seemed to understand this better than anyone. Her face had gone ashen as she watched our extended family and Dad's associates piece together the implications of what they were witnessing. For someone who'd built her identity around being envied and admired, the sudden shift in public perception was clearly devastating. Aunt Margaret edged closer, her eyes wide with a mix of concern and curiosity, while Robert Chin nodded subtly at Marcus, as if acknowledging a fellow strategist in a game Darren had lost. The piano music in the background felt almost mocking now, its soft melody underscoring the drama like a soundtrack to our unraveling family ties. You really think this is coincidence? Darren pressed, his voice rising, drawing even more attention. A few mourners pretended to adjust floral arrangements nearby, but their ears were tuned to every word. You expect me to believe you just happened to meet my ex-fiancé, work with her, marry her, without knowing our history? Marcus remained composed, his hands still in mine, a steady anchor amid the storm. I knew of your history after Laura and I grew close, he said evenly, but my decisions, professional or personal, have always been about value, not vendettas. Laura's strength and talent drew me in, any connection to you was secondary, at best. The response was measured, but it landed like a quiet thunderclap, emphasizing how small Darren's role had become in our lives. Vanessa clutched her bracelet, the diamonds that once symbolized her triumph, now seeming like weights dragging her down. This can't be happening, she muttered, more to herself than anyone, her eyes flicking to the growing cluster of onlookers. I felt a surge of clarity, the kind that comes from years of quiet rebuilding. Darren, Vanessa, I said, my tone firm but not cruel. You built your life on what you took from me, but I've built mine on what I discovered in myself. Marcus isn't revenge, he's real partnership, the kind that doesn't require stealing or scheming. The words flowed from a place of hard-won peace, not anger. Mrs. Henderson gasped softly, and I caught Robert Chin suppressing a smile, perhaps recalling Dad's stories of business ethics over whiskey. Dad had always valued integrity in deals and relationships. Seeing Darren exposed here felt like a posthumous nod from him. The tension thickened as Darren's face reddened, his fists tightening further. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed, glancing at Vanessa as if she were partly to blame for this humiliation. Our life, it's solid, successful. This little show changes nothing. But it changed everything, and they knew it. Vanessa's earlier boasts about the mansion, the money, rang hollow now, her designer sorrow cracking under the scrutiny. We should go, she said weakly, tugging at Darren's sleeve, her voice lacking its usual command. As they turned away, the mourners parted like a sea, whispers following them to the door. Aunt Margaret approached me then, her hand on my arm. Laura, dear, that was unexpected. Your father would be proud. Her words warmed me, a reminder that not all family bonds were broken. Marcus and I stayed a while longer, accepting condolences that now carried undertones of admiration. You've done well for yourself, Robert Chin said quietly to me, and with a sharp business mind like Hamilton's, smart match. We exchanged knowing looks. He'd likely heard rumors of Darren's overextended ventures, the kind that crumble under pressure. As the service wound down, the funeral home's lights dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the room. Marcus and I walked to our car in the cooling evening air, the weight of the day lifting with each step. You were magnificent, he murmured, kissing my forehead. I just spoke my truth, I replied, leaning into him. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, filled with reflections on how far I'd come, from fleeing in heartbreak to standing tall amid the ruins of their facade. That night, as rain pattered against the window, I thought of Dad's steady presence, how he'd worried for both his daughters, but believed in redemption. The confrontation hadn't been about winning. It was about closure, a chapter closing on pain I'd carried too long. Yet, as I drifted to sleep, a small part of me wondered if Vanessa's tremble signaled the start of her own awakening, or if pride would keep her trapped in the life she'd stolen. The knock came 3 days after we'd returned to Seattle, soft and hesitant against our apartment door. Marcus was in his study, reviewing client proposals, while I sorted through the condolence cards that had arrived in our absence. The funeral felt like a distant dream now, surreal in the way traumatic events often do once you're removed from their immediate aftermath. I opened the door, expecting a neighbor or delivery person, but instead found Vanessa standing in our hallway. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes, the perfect makeup, the armor of expensive accessories that had defined her for as long as I could remember. She wore jeans, actual jeans, not the designer variety that cost more than most people's rent, and a simple gray sweater that looked like it had seen multiple wash cycles. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes and a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her hands, those perfectly manicured hands that had once displayed her massive wedding ring like a trophy, were naked, except for a simple gold band that looked somehow diminished without its usual accompanying diamonds. "Laura," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" I stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the stranger who wore my sister's face. Part of me wanted to close the door, to protect the peace Marcus and I had built from the chaos she represented. But another part, the part that remembered sharing secrets under blanket forts and practicing dance routines in our childhood bedroom, felt compelled to let her in. "Marcus is working," I said finally, stepping aside to allow her entry. "We can sit in the kitchen." She followed me through our small apartment, her eyes taking in the modest furnishings, the photographs of our wedding day, the comfortable clutter of two people who'd built a life together through careful accumulation rather than dramatic acquisition. If she was judging our simple lifestyle compared to the mansion she described at the funeral, her face didn't show it. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. The same table where Marcus and I ate breakfast every morning, where we discussed our days over dinner, where we'd planned our future during countless quiet conversations. Having Vanessa in this sacred space felt like inviting a storm into a sanctuary. "I don't know where to start," she said, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug I'd offered her as if it were a lifeline. "Everything's falling apart, Laura. Everything." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them in for so long that they'd built up pressure behind her carefully constructed facade. She told me about the money, how Darren had been living beyond their means for years, using credit and loans to maintain the lifestyle he felt entitled to. The mansion was mortgaged to the hilt, the cars leased with payments they could barely afford, and her jewelry, the diamonds she'd flaunted so proudly, were mostly financed through a high-end jeweler who was now threatening legal action. "He controls everything," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Every credit card, every bank account, every investment. I don't even know how much debt we're really in because he handles all the finances. But the calls have started. Collection agencies, lawyers, creditors. They call all day, every day." I listened without interrupting, watching my sister, this woman who'd once seemed invincible in her cruelty, crumble before my eyes. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd spent the funeral bragging about having the man, the money, and the mansion, when all three were apparently built on financial quicksand. "The worst part," she continued, her voice dropping to barely audible, "is that I think he resents me for it. For the debt, for the pressure, for not being worth all the trouble he went through to get me." The phrase hung between us like a confession. To get me. As if she were a prize he'd won rather than a person he'd chosen to love. As if their entire relationship had been transactional from the beginning. And now that the transaction was proving costly, he was having buyer's remorse. The funeral was the first time he'd looked at me with anything other than irritation in months, she admitted, and even then, it was only because other people were watching. The moment we got in the car afterward, he started yelling. About Marcus, about how I'd humiliated him, about how my family had always been beneath his standards. She looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Why didn't you ever fight back, Laura? Why didn't you try to destroy me the way I destroyed you?" The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't expected it, but because I'd never really examined my own motivations closely enough to articulate an answer. Why hadn't I fought back? Why hadn't I tried to expose their affair before the wedding, or sought revenge in the immediate aftermath? "Because I didn't have to," I said finally, the words coming from some deep well of understanding I hadn't known existed. Time fought for me. It was true, I realized as I said it. While I'd been rebuilding myself in Seattle, learning to be whole again, time had been working its own quiet justice. The relationship built on betrayal had rotted from within, just as Dad used to say about buildings constructed on weak foundations. You could paint over the cracks and reinforce the walls, but eventually the fundamental flaws would bring the whole structure down. Vanessa stared at me across the table, her expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. "You really moved on. You actually built something real." "Yes," I said simply. "I did." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug in absent circles. When she spoke again, Her voice was so soft, I had to lean forward to hear her. "I found something while I was cleaning out Dad's desk," she said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small leather-bound journal. "I thought you should see it." The journal was one I recognized from childhood. Dad's daily planner where he'd written everything from business appointments to grocery lists to random thoughts that struck him throughout the day. Vanessa opened it to a page marked with a faded receipt and slid it across the table. The entry was dated 6 months before Dad's death, written in his familiar scrawl. "Talk to Laura today. She sounds happy, really happy, not just putting on a brave face. Her voice has music in it again, the way it used to when she was little and would sing while doing chores. I think she's found her way back to herself. My girls were once best friends, drawing pictures together, sharing everything, protecting each other from the world. Vanessa has forgotten that version of herself, but maybe someday she'll remember. Maybe someday they'll both find their way back to each other." The words blurred as tears I hadn't expected filled my eyes. Dad had seen through all of it. My careful cheerfulness during our phone calls, Vanessa's hollow victory, the fundamental sadness that had colored our family dynamic since the betrayal. But he'd also seen hope, possibility, the chance for healing that I'd never even considered. "He never stopped believing we could fix this," Vanessa whispered, her own tears falling freely now. "Even after everything I did, everything I destroyed, he still thought." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Dad had seen something in both of us that we'd lost sight of. The capacity for redemption, for growth, for becoming better than our worst moments. We sat in silence for several minutes, the journal open between us like a bridge across 4 years of pain and resentment. I found myself remembering the sister Vanessa had been before jealousy and competition had poisoned our relationship. The girl who taught me to braid friendship bracelets, who'd stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia, who'd fiercely defended me against playground bullies with the righteous fury of an avenging angel. "I don't expect forgiveness," Vanessa said finally, closing the journal and sliding it back toward me. "I don't deserve it, and I'm not even sure I know how to earn it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I took from you wasn't just a man or a wedding. I took your faith in family, in loyalty, in love itself." She stood up slowly, like someone much older than her 36 years. "But you found your way back anyway. You found something real with Marcus. Something I don't think I've ever had. That takes courage I never possessed." I walked her to the door, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't name. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined for years, the moment where I'd finally unleash all my accumulated hurt and rage. Instead, it felt like watching someone I'd once loved very much finally understand the true cost of their choices. "Vanessa," I called as she reached for the door handle. She turned back, hope flickering briefly in her exhausted eyes. "You didn't ruin my life," I said, surprised by the calm certainty in my own voice. "You shattered it completely, but you also gave me the chance to build something better from the pieces, something that was actually mine." She nodded, a small smile ghosting across her lips, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her since childhood. "Take care of yourself," I added. "Really take care of yourself." After she left, I sat alone with Dad's journal, reading his words over and over until Marcus found me there an hour later. I told him about the visit, about the debt, about the quiet devastation of a life built on lies finally collapsing under its own weight. "Do you feel vindicated?" he asked, pulling me into his arms. I considered the question seriously. Did I feel vindicated, satisfied, triumphant? "No," I said finally. "I feel sad, but also free." And for the first time in 4 years, that was enough.